comrades, it is that time. Welcome back to the Liberation Hour. Yes, this is your host, Comrade Felicity, coming at you live from WRFU 104.5 Radio Free Urbana. Folks, welcome back. We're here again. Last week, I was gone at Labor Talks, yes. But I'm back. I'm here, I'm queer, and I'm ready to talk about communism. So that's what we're going to do here on the Liberation Hour. But first, the top of the hour, what do we call it? The legal disclaimer. Greetings, comrades. WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign online community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU UCIMC. All right, folks, with that out of the way, let's get started. We have a lot to cover today. I have a few great stories here to discuss and a couple of announcements. So first, once again, the Red Youth Rising tenant campaign has launched. If you are interested, you should most certainly check it out. Red Youth Rising, it's a .org website. So if you just go to redyouthrising.org, you should be able to find it right there at the top of your Google homepage. And you can also find us on Instagram. There is many different chapters. We have a Champaign chapter founded by yours truly. We have a Chicago chapter, a Portland chapter, a Columbus chapter. There's chapters all over the place. So if you are interested and you want to learn more, please reach out via Instagram, on the website. There's probably a Twitter handle out there somewhere. And yeah, let's boogie down. Let's do some tenants' rights. Let's do some tenant organizing. Let's form a tenant union, perhaps, maybe. And moving on, we also have the next bout of Labor Talks, a meeting, specifically a communist meeting talking about Marxist-Leninist ideas. And the next one coming up on October 15th, hosted by yours truly, is on imperialism. What is it? Why is it important to understand? And why should we know more? If you're interested, please stop by Channing Murray. It's from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. At Channing Murray. Sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought there. Channing Murray, Labor Talks. Come join, talk about imperialism, talk about communism, and what we can do for the future. Folks, all right, let's go ahead. Let's jump right into the news. Later for y'all, I have a really awesome segment that I did with Comrade Red from the American Party of Labor in the Maryland division, in which we talk about manufacturing consent, the news, liberal media, and what we can do about it. Comrade Red, they go by they, them pronouns, have a ton of experience writing for the Red Phoenix, which is the American Party of Labor's newspaper. I have, yours truly, have written a piece specifically on Zoran Mamdani. And so if you are interested in learning more about Comrade Red's writing, you could definitely go on over to the Red Phoenix and read up on what they have been talking about. But we did a really amazing discussion around manufacturing consent here in the United States. Of course, as per usual, if you're new here, usually I play the first 30 minutes of that segment, and then you can find the rest of it on my YouTube channel. I try to upload as soon as possible, but life circumstances do happen, so just keep an eye out. You can go find my YouTube channel. It's at Communist Bananas, and I am called Comrade Felicity on there with my signature picture of Jennifer Coolidge wearing a Soviet Union little furry hat. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the news. Let's see what's going on. There's a lot happening in the world, and just the world at large. Let's go ahead and let's see it through a communist lens, perhaps. So, the first thing I want to talk about today is our regular climate update. And first things first, climate refugees, relocation. How does it work? What's happening? Why are we doing it? And is it successful? Question mark. Well, the thing to understand about climate refugees and climate change is it's inevitable. Unfortunately, because of the way that climate change has been perpetuated by large corporations who frankly do not give a single crap about our health. Yes, I cannot swear on air. It is quite frustrating, but FCC guidelines restrict me. So they don't really care. They do not care about how local communities are affected by their policies, by what they do. And so now we are at this point in climate change in which climate refugees are absolutely a thing and are absolutely something that we need to be aware of. And unfortunately, this is a reality now. And so I have a couple stories here, one from Inside Climate and another one from the BBC. The first one from Inside Climate is on Louisiana climate relocation, and it's specifically about a group of indigenous people who had to be relocated due to their island or their part of Louisiana basically sinking. We can see this in a lot of coastal regions, places like Florida, and all of those places along the coast, which are currently being eaten up by the ocean. And what do we do about this? How do we deal with this problem, and how do we support the folks who are currently in the crosshairs of this, who have been living on these coastal regions for generations at this point and now have to leave? So the first quote I have from you today from Inside Climate, from Jones and Simon from Floodlight, which is a specific kind of organization which I believe does a lot of climate education. They say that leaving the tight-knit community of his family, which is this is following the story of Chris Brunette. Leaving the tight-knit community of Chris Brunette's family had called, where him and his family had called home for 5 generations along the Louisiana coast, was one of the hardest things he has had to do. But 3 years ago, he felt he had no other choice. The Gulf of Mexico's, or Gulf of America if you're weird, swelling waters were gradually consuming Isle de Jean Charles. It's very French. The narrow strip of land in Terrebonne Parish, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, that has been the homeland for I'm going to say there's other parts of this name, but the part that I can pronounce, Choctaw Indians or Choctaw Native people since the 1830s. In 2016, Louisiana received $48.3 million in federal community development block grant money to relocate 37 residents or families of Isle de Jean Charles as climate change, hurricanes, and sea level rise made the once thriving fishing community completely uninhabitable. This plan was the first relocation of an entire community that was fully funded by the federal government. The island used to encompass more than 22,000 acres, but has shrunk to about 320 acres due to erosion, land loss caused by severe storms, man-made canals, and sea level rise spurred by climate change. Isle de Jean Charles is a shell of a place once filled with life. The remaining strip is now dotted with dilapidated homes for those who fled. A few properties are used as recreational camps by their owners. This new chapter of former island residents is no fairy tale. They say that their new homes are substandard, with rainwater seeping through doorways, malfunctioning appliances, and flooded yards causing costly repairs. I wish, quote, I just wish that they would have given themselves a little bit more time to try to prevent so many of these issues that we had over here, Brunette says. Some things that immediately just broke down right away, whether it be electrical, whether it be plumbing, whether it be exterior, interior. And ironically, their new community, that's end quote, and ironically, their new community, dubbed New Isle, could literally become an island surrounded by water if predictions of accelerated coastal land loss and inland flooding come to pass. What was supposed to be a model for how the government could get people out of harm's way along the country's steadily eroding coastlines has instead become a cautionary tale for the estimated 2.5 million Americans who could be forced to relocate away from the coast over the next 25 years. Okay, so what exactly do we make of this? Well, I say a few things here. First of all, we can never actually rely on a government that never held the companies that caused this accountable in the first place. I think that the relocation efforts, while very noble, are ultimately a band-aid for the fact that this was very preventable. We've had data going back since the 50s knowing that this was going to be a problem, that there was going to be mass issues with coastal erosion, with sea level rise, and just plainly due to the fact of how much the greenhouse gas emissions, and just the gradual warming of the earth as a result of the amount of mining and emissions that these giant corporations have been adding to. We can only go so far when we critique individual use, because individuals are not responsible for the larger material conditions that are put upon us by institutions who aim to exploit us in the beginning. I think that when this is an incredibly sad story of a community that has been completely upended and is continuing to be upended by shoddy policy that is not actually addressing the problem and is instead just trying to put a Band-Aid solution over a larger issue, which is the way that oil and gas companies and companies adjacent to them are conducting themselves. There has been absolutely no legitimate effort to actually hold these companies accountable. Why, you may ask? Because either the same companies lobbying our Congress people and our policymakers to ensure that no actual legislation comes about that will significantly harm their profit margins. We must keep this in mind when we are looking at stories like this. While I think that the efforts were noble to relocate these families and these folks who are severely harmed by sea level rise, ultimately we can see that they didn't really put that much effort in because these people's material conditions suck. They are living in subpar conditions, which I think most of the representatives who, or the folks in Congress and in the government who pushed for this initiative would not want to live in themselves. But of course, up on Capitol Hill, they're very divorced from regular Americans' experiences, and this is unsurprising. It's extremely sad, to be quite frank. It's extremely sad because it didn't have to get to this point. But as Marxists, we do have to look at this from a dialectical lens, and we have to see the full picture here. And the full picture also includes the solution, which is not only grassroots community effort, but real organizing around how we can not only hold these corporations accountable, but how we can completely dismantle them, because they will never stop. And frankly, they have completely bought out our representatives. They've completely bought out any semblance of democracy that was meant to exist in this country, because there is in no shape or form can liberalism live alongside democracy. There is no world in which the state is above corporations under liberalism. This is not the case. There will always be moneyed interests under liberalism that will lobby our policymakers with their shiny cash to worsen our material conditions and better their own. And we have to keep in mind these grassroots stories, these very, these are not necessarily, well, they are anecdotal. This story that is coming out, and this was published back in, this was published, I want to say less than a week ago, September 28th, 2025 in Inside Climate. This is fairly recent. This is actually quite recent. And we have to, when we are considering this story, we have to understand that the victims of this issue are not limited to the folks that we're talking about here on coastal cities, but also those of us who live inland. We are all victims of climate change when it comes to forest fires, when it comes to flooding, when it comes to hurricanes. All of these issues are not our individual faults, but the faults of the institutions which our representatives were meant to hold accountable, and they haven't. This is a democracy in decay. In fact, if you ask me, it was never a democracy to begin with, because if it was, the livelihoods of these people would still be living on their island. They would not be dealing with these insane conditions. But the fact is that profit will always come first under our current system. And so not only do we need to create close, tight-knit community bonds, but we need to be actively organizing politically and socially against these interests. We need to be organizing for the interests of the people, of the folks like Mr. Chris here, who have been dealing with the fallout of climate change directly. We need to be advocating for their material interests and by proxy the material interests of us all. None of us are free until all of us are free. And none of us will find true salvation away from capitalist and moneyed interests unless we get rid of them for good. And this means, in the case of folks like Chris Brunette, he is one of many of us who could be dealing with this at any given moment. And so it's extremely important to recognize this and understand that we all have a hand to play in our collective liberation. And this means supporting folks like Chris and his family and families like his through these transitions, because it is going to be extremely hard, and providing for one another and actively fighting against these interests who are trying to, for example, build data centers next to our cities and towns that are eating up our water and our electricity, things, resources that should be going directly to the people. And this kind of brings me, I would say, to my next story, which is about Starbucks union workers and the CEO. Now, I've kind of seen this swirling around a little bit in the news, but this is from The Guardian, this article was published about 2 months ago, July 24th, 2025. The Starbucks CEO, Brian Niccol, made 6,666 times more than his average worker last year, according to a report on the growing gap between top executives and their workers. That's a funny number. I know everyone else had to be thinking it, but that's a hilarious number to be using, because guy is literally the devil. Like, that is, I mean, you couldn't get more on the nose than that one. But I say, quote from The Guardian, the inequality gap between CEOs' pay and that of their median workers rose in 2024 to 285 to 1 from 268 to 1 in 2023. According to a report released this week by the largest federation of labor unions in the U.S., the AFL-CIO. The CEO pay rose 7% in 2024 among the S&P 500 companies, an increase of 1.24 million from 2023. Niccol, who joined the company in September of 2024, received more than 97.8 million in total compensation in 2024. The typical Starbucks worker's pay was less than 15,000. Quote, the median Starbucks worker would have had to start working for Starbucks in 4,000. Sorry, my brain just completely gave out on me there. 4643 BC, during the Stone Age, just to earn what the Starbucks CEO earned in 2024 alone. In the wake of Trump's 2017 tax cuts, corporations saw their tax rates fall from an average of 22% to 12.8% after the law went into effect. And under his presidential term, average CEO pay rose from $13.1 million in December of 2016 to $15.5 million in December of 2020. And corporate income tax collections dropped in the wake of Trump's 2017 tax cuts by $93 billion in 2018. And this article was written by Michael Sainato. Sorry about that. Sorry, Michael. But what I would like to point out from this piece, and also just in general, is, first of all, this is completely unsurprising, but also the fact that this is even allowed to happen and people are not in the streets rioting right now, I think really speaks to this idea that we have been completely subdued into thinking that this is normal. The fact is that a lot of propaganda that the Starbucks Corporation is putting out will tell you that it is the fault of the unionized workers as to why they are closing different locations. This is not the truth. The truth is that Starbucks workers are currently unionizing because they are not making a living wage. And they are, not only are they not making a living wage, they are working in terrible working conditions. And this is unacceptable. This is completely unacceptable. The fact that the Starbucks CEO is making egregious amounts of money, by the way, who needs that much money? First of all, if we just consider this from a very practical standpoint, who needs that much money? And if anyone is listening to this and being like, well, he earned it. No, he didn't. He came into the company in 2024. It's not like he's been there toiling away for 30 years. Bro has been there for like he's been there for about a full year now, and he's making over 6,000 times the amount that an average Starbucks employee makes. That's ridiculous. If you are going to be someone who's going to defend this kind of behavior, then I'm sorry, but you're cooked. You are so capitalist brained. You're acting like a capitalist when you have no capital. I'm gonna steal that straight from the Hasanabi rhetoric book. Like, what are we talking about here? This is crazy. The fact that this person is making so much money and is actively trying to union bust, first of all, is completely unsurprising. But second, this right here is in your face proof. This is proof in and of itself that the current system is not working. They have plenty of money to redistribute amongst their workers, and yet they aren't. Why? Why? Just ask yourself the simple question. If they paid their workers, what, like $5-10 more an hour, it still wouldn't be enough, but it would most certainly um, support a living, it would support a basic lifestyle. The fact that this person is making so much money because, quote unquote, the market has decided that this is their value. Well, the market's wrong. I'm sorry, if we're gonna sit here and say that, well, the market decided it, so I guess it's just, it's written in stone now. This man has to make millions of dollars a year. Sorry, guys. Like, okay, that's great for him, and for the rest of us, like, if we as the collective, as the working people, are just going to accept this, then we have failed our fellow man. This is completely unacceptable on just a basic human level. The fact that this person is hoarding so much wealth, and not redistributing it directly back to the working people of this company is proof in and of itself that capitalists will never, ever do wealth redistribution. They will never, they will never consider us in this equation as people worthy of a basic living wage. That will never happen, because under the capitalist system, it is in the capitalist's best interest to pay us as little as possible, and in the wage laborer's best interest to demand as much as possible. And in a system in which the capitalist has access to all of the resources, all of the wealth, to lobby our congresspeople, to arm militias, to take us out, to harm working people, we can never win. We cannot, there is no reforming the system to make it livable for working people, because that's not reality. If we are considering this dialectically, then we must consider the fact that reform has never worked in a capitalist system which only aims to exploit wage laborers. We cannot forget this. This is a basic fact. This is just a basic fact. This is where I have fundamental disagreements with parties like the Social Democrat, the SDS. It's not that I necessarily disagree with the end goal, which is socialism. I disagree with the fact that we want to play nice with the capitalists who absolutely do not want to play nice with us. And in no way do they want to play nice with us. In no way do they want to work with working people to make our conditions better. This is complete fantasy. The only way that we will ever be able to hold the capitalist accountable is through a workers' revolution. I'm not doing a call to action here. For FCC guidelines, I am not doing a call to action. I am not saying we should do a revolution right now. I'm not, no. All I'm saying is that reform under a capitalist system in which the capitalist has full access to not only manufacturing consent, which we are going to be talking about in about 7 minutes, but also has full access to worker suppression, union busting, we will never see full liberation. And this is why I advocate for, at some point, not now, but at some point, a workers' revolution. This is not to say that the capitalists, the people who are the capitalists, are not allowed to live. Of course not. This is to say that wealth redistribution is a net positive, and we should be doing it. Because people like Brian Nichol, the CEO of Starbucks, is never going to redistribute that wealth to the working people of Starbucks, which is why they are unionizing to begin with, and why he is actively trying to union bust, because they don't want to be held accountable, which is what a union is there to do. And so my last story for you, before we get to my segment with Comrade Red on manufacturing consent, is the Antifa terrorist designation by the Trump administration. Now, this is the story of the night, and we only have about 5 minutes to talk about it. Sorry. But this is from the BBC by Slack, Devlin, and Sardazi. I'm sorry, I'm saying that name. We are not known for doing names good on this show. But this is from the BBC reporting, saying that the terrorist group designations normally reserved for foreign organizations allow the administration to ban members and cease funding, among other actions. Trump's order directs all agencies and departments to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle any and all illegal operations conducted by Antifa and its supporters. Antifa, short for anti-fascist, is a decentralized leftist movement that opposes far-right racist and fascist groups that have long been a top target of Trump and other Republicans. It is a loose, leaderless affiliation that lacks a membership list or structure, which raises questions about how Trump will actually target the group. Okay, so just working off of this information, because I kind of have a working knowledge of, I do actually have a very good working knowledge of how Antifa actually works, because I would call myself a member of Antifa. Antifa just means that you're opposed to fascism. And I think that rather than necessarily talking about Antifa being designated as a terrorist organization, we should more be, and how this is, bad for leftists, of course, we should more be discussing the fact that the Trump administration did this strategically because the Trump administration is fascist. If they weren't, then there would be no need to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, but they do. Why? Well, let's consider this in its fullest materialist. Let's just consider this in its fullest form. So, him designating Antifa, first of all, which again is very decentralized. We don't have a leadership. We don't have funding. That's not how it works. So why would they be doing this to begin with? Well, it's because by just at large saying that being an anti-fascist is being a terrorist is saying that essentially those who we are protesting are fascist, which under this policy is seen as terrorist activity, essentially saying that the fascists are in some way in the right, which is very concerning, and more people should be extremely concerned about this, especially because of the fact that if the government is designating anti-fascism as terrorism, how would they designate fascism? Well, we already know. They designate fascism as a good thing, as something that the country should be leaning more into, which is why they are so opposed to anti-fascism. And I think that we should, as leftists, we should be very concerned about this and actively agitating against this, especially agitating liberals who probably see this as a free speech violation. It's more than that. It is absolutely more than that. This is a stepping stone. I'm not going to repeat that poem that is completely overused, first they came for the blah, 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 because we already know. But I would say one distinct marker of fascist organizations from those that are not fascist is that fascists always target the communists, the trade unionists, and the socialists first. Why? Because these are the people that have the most means to organize the proletariat and the working people against fascism, which is why they want to do as much as they can to tamper down our influence. By saying anti-fascism is a terrorist organization is ostensibly saying that communists, socialists, and trade unionists are terrorists. That is that is the baseline here. Now, not maybe necessarily trade unionists, because a lot of unions are, have very much capitulated to not only liberal narratives, but also very right-wing ones. So, I mean, this is, in the context of current day, I would say it's more directed towards communists and socialists. But that doesn't necessarily mean that trade unionists are left out of the equation. It's more of just leftists in general. The argument that the Trump administration is poorly making, but making it nonetheless, is that if you are a communist, if you are someone who is, and he's also, they've made this very clear, if you're an anti-capitalist, you are an enemy of the state. And the state is essentially declaring itself a fascist one. And this should be, why are we going to our normal jobs when this is happening? We are currently living under an administration that has essentially just declared itself a fascist one. This should be extremely concerning. This is wrong on so many levels. They wanted to sit here and cry and moan about how we shouldn't have called Charlie Kirk a neo-Nazi because that's what apparently got him shot. This is untrue, first of all. But I think it's important to recognize that this is exactly what the Nazis did. like this is not any different from how the Nazis operated. This was, of course, they were much more strategic, methodical, and I mean, let's be real. The Nazis had way more drip than our current fascists do. Our current fascists look like insane people, because they are, and so were the Nazis. But they were much more. They were much better organized. But either way, a fascist is a fascist is a fascist. And our current American fascists are trying to completely dismantle any systems that we had in place to stop them, which weren't that many because you scratch a liberal, the fascist bleeds. But nonetheless, my point stands. We need to as working people and as communists, for those listening who are communist, um, we need to be actively agitating. There is no time to waste. Whether this was simply symbolic or this is something that the Trump administration is looking to actually act upon, this is very concerning, and we need to be actively agitating against people just writing this off as another crazy Trump thing. The fact that they are willing to do this so publicly and so openly really, I think, speaks a lot to how despondent the American population is right now. This is unacceptable. This is completely unacceptable. In a world which talks so much about the horrors of the Holocaust and the terrors of fascism in the 20th century, we sure as heck do not, when fascism is looking us right in the face, we sure as heck do not really, we aren't really using our critical thinking skills. And this is the time to be doing that. So when we're looking at this situation unfolding, leftists that are listening, working people in general that are listening, this is the time. There is no time like the present to begin organizing. If you don't know how to organize, that's okay. Go on over to the APL website. Go on over to the Teamsters if you're looking to unionize. Go on over look at the PSL. There are so many leftist organizations right now that are doing the work on the ground, and there are many folks that you can get connected with. Go get connected with your local rapid response network for ICE, responding to ICE calls that have been happening in different cities. Get connected. Join a Facebook group if you have to. They are out there. There's one called Cure here in Champaign-Urbana, which I am also part of. So please do not look away from this as just the crazy antics of the Trump administration. This is dangerous. This is extremely dangerous, and we need to be like we have been needing to ring the bell and say, hey, it's time to start organizing. We never should have stopped organizing, but if you have not been, that's okay, but it's time to get started. All right, folks. So that we're a little bit over time, but that's okay because I like talking. But let's go ahead and get into my segment with Comrade Red on manufacturing consent. I'm super excited to talk about this with y'all today. And I'm really, if you're interested in listening to more, please go on over to my YouTube channel and listen to the full clip. But Comrade Red and I had a really great conversation on manufacturing consent, how it works in liberal media, and why we need to be paying more attention to it, and what to do about it. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and get this started.
Right, Felicity. Thank you for having me on. I'm Red of the APL, from the Patty Whalen division in the Mid Atlantic. I kind of prefer they them pronouns. And I've been an organizer, mostly a journalist with the APL for the last five years and change. And I think that this is just one of the most important things that we could talk about is this kind of assault on truth, this commodification of it by big capitalist press. And, as a journalist trying to build up an independent, revolutionary, proletarian press, it's something
Mm.
that we really have to identify if we're going to move the letter forward, to get people thinking and acting on the things that really matter if we're going to change things.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much to discuss when we talk about the media, especially it being co-opted and basically taken over completely. Or if I don't, honestly, I would say it's probably always been this way in the United States with, you know, giant corporation billionaire moneyed interests essentially using the media, corporate media specifically, as a means to manufacture consent around different wars and imperialism, essentially, that the United States has been partaking in for many, many years at this point. Um, and so to get this conversation started off, something I wanted to kind of, I guess, look at is how how this idea of manufacturing consent came to be. I mean, there's the infamous Noam Chomsky book that we all know and love. Noam Chomsky himself is an interesting figure, I think, because while he's a leftist, I don't think he would call himself a communist.
No, I don't think so. I think that a lot of the I would definitely think of Noam Chomsky as a product of the new left, this kind of student movement of the 60s and 70s that has buckled under the fear mongering of communism and is trying to kind of grope around in the dark for a third way, whether it's anarchism or social democracy. And I think while we have to admit that Noam Chomsky does accidentally hit a lot of very important parts of social conflict and dialectical materialism, it would be inappropriate for us to say that he's like the voice of the American left. Um, I also think of Michael Parenti, who also we have to admit has a lot of problems.
Mm.
But his inventing reality has also been something that's sparked a lot of interest that precedes manufacturing consent, and I think it's unfortunately somewhat telling that inventing reality by a self-abscribed Marxist-Leninist is kind of pushed off to the wayside in front of someone who's more palatable and friendly to the status quo with manufacturing consent. Maybe the title's quippier. I gotta give them that, but it's not as dramatic as inventing reality. I would say.
Yeah.
But yeah, but the fundamental principle is the same. Is that you know as revolutionary minded people, you kind of identify that it's not so much this or that administration that's in the wrong, it's fundamental systemic exploitation. And if the truth was told on that, the bourgeoisie would not last a day. So
Absolutely.
lies and deceptions and distractions are absolutely essential to the survival of the capitalist order. And I think that's what, you've touched on with addressing Noam Chomsky's book on the subject.
Yeah, I would also like to introduce another book that I have been slowly getting through and reading with my very busy schedule. I've been reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is, I would say, adjacent to what Manufacturing Consent and the Michael Parenti book are talking about, where, it feels like there's this kind of inverse happening between leftists in the United States and conspiracy theorists in the United States, in which there's been this push to find a group to blame. And Fox News and like Steve Bannon have been very, very effective at basically reinventing neo-Nazism in the United States with a different name. And a lot of people have bought into this as a viable option towards finding true change against what's like the systemic problems of the United States, not realizing that it is like the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. She talks about her doppelganger, Naomi Wolf. They both are of the same name. They both are Jewish women who are academics and scholars and writers. And you can kind of see how these two women kind of like Naomi Klein is very much a leftist associated with communism. She wrote the shock doctrine, and she wrote a lot of really telling pieces, especially in like the Guardian around what's going on in Gaza. And then Naomi Wolf basically became an insane conspiracy theorist, especially when COVID hit. And it's a great book for those who don't know and would like to read it. I highly recommend. But I would say that's also pertinent to the discussion today around how people are currently perceiving our bourgeois. I wouldn't even call it a democracy at this point. The state that we are living in. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a like literature is absolutely like a great place to start. Like
Hmm.
I did not start in politics as a Marxist-Leninist. Uh you could probably trace it back to 2015, and I was following the Bernie Sanders campaign and for
Right.
a long time. And I think a lot of people had that similar experience. I was in high school calling myself a democratic socialist when, I just supported like Bernie Sanders' flavor of social democracy. And
Right.
like his literature that he had produced and literature that other people of like the social democratic left of the time, was very like enticing and like very refreshing to me because I liked literature, mostly fiction up to that point, but I mostly shied away from politics, and I think this is what capitalist press feeds off of is this disinterest in politics. Politics is so, what's the Fed, or I don't know, like voting's so complicated
Mm,
or it doesn't accomplish anything.
right.
But I think what social democracy accomplished in this country was identifying in the cultural zeitgeist class struggle. Even if its solutions to it are going to fail, and they have failed over the last 10 years, it has revealed the sheets and exposed Dr. Oz manipulating the scenes to his profit the whole
Hmm.
time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be learned, especially when you kind of do the deprogram, as many leftists call it, away from liberal news media that is trying to basically co-opt our revolutionary fervor into just voting harder for Blue MAGA. Basically, I just did an episode with Comrade Keegan last week in which we talked about Kamala Harris and the Kamala Harris campaign, and basically how like her campaign was really not a left-wing campaign at all, and yet there were so many people who were feeding on this idea that she was going to somehow be different or better than what the Republicans are currently doing. And so yeah, I think that when we talk about traditional media, for example, like CNN, and MSNBC and everything, so much of their narrative is around maintaining um, I don't know, what would we call it? Like I would definitely say that they're distinct from like Fox News and that they aren't just like openly lying all the time, but they're definitely not telling the truth. There's usually a kernel of truth in what they are trying to get out there. I would say like a good something that I think about most recently is how I believe it was on MSNBC, a host was talking about how he wasn't going to mourn Charlie Kirk because he was a terrible person. Then he got fired for saying that. When it wasn't really anything that he didn't say anything terribly bad or horrible about this person. He just said, I don't want to mourn a person who was an open neo-Nazi, and then immediately got fired. But Ezra Klein can write in the New York Times about how Charlie Kirk was doing politics, quote unquote, the right way, you know?
Yeah, I think that if we consider like MSNBC and CNN as like these bastions of of liberalism and of the Democrats are really, I would say, the conservative party in this country. The
Mm,
Republicans are the reactionary party in this country. The Democrats want to keep Medicaid. They want to maybe limit the number of wars we go into. Maybe they want to maintain a level of immigrants that big businesses can exploit. They want to marginally raise the minimum wage, but the Republicans are bringing us even further into the abyss. More wars, maybe no minimum wage, no like decreased immigration, and so on. So I think that in this media landscape that we have, most of what we see from so-called liberal sources is this defense of the status quo. Like we look at you mentioned the host from MSNBC who was fired, and I was just reading up on the Jimmy Kimmel situation,
mm,
and I noticed that Republicans who celebrated the suspension of his show, it hasn't been canceled, but it has been suspended. All he had said was that Republicans are weaponizing the death of Charlie Kirk for political gain. That is absolutely correct. Jimmy Kimmel posted on social media about his condolences to the Kirk family and to all victims of senseless gun violence. All that Kimmel said that was so inflammatory was that Fox News and the Republican Party were weaponizing Charlie Kirk's murder to to basically fearmonger about transgender people or the left when the actual assailant was more in line with Charlie Kirk than with Kamala Harris even. So,
Yeah.
um, like if Jimmy Kimmel can be punished for not for telling the truth, then I think that the real threat to censorship uh, is undeniably not just the Supreme Court or the Trump administration, but it's the very fragile system of these monopoly media companies that are buckling under almost no pressure to censor even the most meager liberal critics of what's going on in the worsening state of our country.
Yeah, I would say that something that I kind of think about when I think about like independent journalism in relation to like corporate media is like there's like a joke out there that's like the highest honor you can have as a journalist is getting basically killed by the CIA because you're about to leak something that the government is doing and they don't want you to. And now I think that I think that it's kind of a dark joke in a lot of ways because it's basically insinuating that a regular corporate media wouldn't dare ever do something like this. Something that I think about is like, for example, like the Epstein situation that was going on. Journalists knew. There were journalists who were very much in the know about what Epstein was doing, and they were basically told not to do anything, not to say anything about it. They couldn't break the story. There's like a viral clip out there of an anchor who was still on air, and I don't think they didn't realize it for a news outlet, and she was basically talking about how she had the story. She had the entire story. She had the victims, like they were ready to go public about it, and she was basically told not to say anything. And I think that on both sides of, the reactionary right wing and the reactionary liberal side are both wanting answers about this whole Epstein situation without really wanting to look at the fact that the very news sources that they are relying on for this information are in the pockets of billionaires who want to protect themselves from Epstein's his own his own issues that he very much roped them into because they wanted to be part of his little sex trafficking network. And so like there's situations like that in which media knew they knew what was going on and they didn't say anything.
Yeah. And I definitely think that, and I think at some point in this conversation, we're going to talk about yellow journalism, about sensational journalism. And I think that the timing of when stories break is absolutely very, like it's very telling, I would say, because this whole Epstein case, it goes far, far beyond Donald Trump returning to the White House. And I think that conspiracy theorists have kind of focused on it because it, as you pointed out earlier, it kind of points the finger at somebody.
Hmm.
And where conspiracy theorists and podcasters and blogs, where they all get it wrong, is that, sex trafficking and, sexual slavery of any kind, it's a very serious problem, but it is not an entity unto itself. It is a symptom of a system built up on wealth and privilege, entitlement, and secrecy that can be bought by your connections to major corporate outlets who control the vast majority of broadcasting and the vast majority of people's news in the country. So I think that's where we really have to, condemn broadcasting. I don't think it's just in the fact that they didn't really tell the story of victims, and that we're seeing this kind of withholding of information with the files not being released to this day.
Hmm.
But it's also this idea of making a monolith of it without condemning the fact that this is the bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein is not just a sex trafficker, he is bourgeois. And the only a bourgeois capitalist person could become one of the most successful and nefarious sex traffickers in human history is because that wealth and technology and privilege enables them to do it. And you'll never see CNN or Fox News address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's bigger than Epstein. I did want to do an episode on Epstein at some point, to kind of discuss the fact that this issue with, or this story that's going on with Jeffrey Epstein, while he is a specific case of someone who, basically their career was, his career was doing sex trafficking for billionaires, it's bigger than him. And it's around this idea, this broader idea that the bourgeois class can do whatever they want. It's, if it wasn't going to be Epstein that was the middleman between billionaires and sexually assaulting children, it was going to be someone else. And there probably is already someone else. He was also an asset to the CIA and Mossad. Like, this was a person who was very connected to some of the deepest, darkest parts of our government, our bourgeois government, who, had access to so many people for the purposes of doing sex trafficking. And, when we're talking about manufacturing consent in this situation, we're also talking about, uh, I would I would say, things like imperialism, and this idea that, like, when we talk about, I don't know, like Gaza, for example, and what's going on in Palestine, for so long, no major media outlet was willing to even broach the topic of it being a genocide. They were attacking anyone left, right, and center who was calling it a genocide. And it is not until very, very recently that the topic of it being a genocide has even, I think, really crossed most Americans' minds who only consume mainstream media.
Right. I think that we're with mainstream media, I would like to contrast that with social media. And Lord
Mm,
knows that social media has so many problems. I know that a lot of, working class or particularly, student and youth Americans are very quick to jump to the defense of something like TikTok, although we can't necessarily trust the consistency of TikTok, especially with like conspiracy theories or far right content that it permits on there, or what it promotes, or misinformation that it doesn't censor, And I think we obviously there's a lot of problems with Twitter, which is bought by an oligarch. Elon
hmm
Musk is perhaps the world's most successful oligarch, and he has his own platform where the rules are so vague that target and marginalize any critics of the status quo, any even progressive or social democratic voices, and it uplifts conspiracy theorists and misinformation and those pundits of the far right. But circling back to the kind of vitality of social media is that in many senses, everyone can be a journalist. Anyone can post something, anyone can take a picture or a video of something and share it to thousands, to tens of thousands, up to millions of people.
hmm
And I think that this is like, thank God for this because I think it'd be very easy for bourgeois press to sweep this all, what's happening in Gaza, under the rug if this wasn't possible. But because of this advent in our social lives, we are able to share the voices of Palestinians themselves who are the victims of this genocide. We are able to quickly spread the information of journalists who are being killed by the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza and elsewhere, and we're able to share a lot of the pictures and videos and photographs that make it absolutely inconceivable for you to call this anything but a genocide. So obviously there's a lot of fine tuning that needs to go on here, and I think that an independent revolutionary voice needs to rise up from social media and kind of cut out a place for itself in this market. Unfortunately, everything's a market in
hmm
capitalism,
Right.
but that is where it needs to stand on its own 2 feet and seize a platform to expose not just the lies and like the misconceptions of capitalist press, but also the penetrate the void of what it doesn't talk about, what it censors by omission. And I think that's what we have the power to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that I think about in a historical context is kind of the manufacturing consent around different wars and conflicts that the United States has gotten itself involved in order to maintain its imperialist grip over other smaller, much weaker countries, and how that hasn't always been as effective as the American media would like us to believe it is. Something that I think about is the Vietnam War, for example, and this kind of interesting flip from the broader American population's trust in the government and the government's willingness to do what is right and what is good. We kind of see that with the Vietnam War, where a lot of Americans were very upset by this war because they just didn't want to be involved in it. Why should I have to be drafted to go fight some like random rice farmers and like and like all of these different people? But if we look at news media, like mainstream media from around that time, it was not really being super critical of the Vietnam War, from what I understand. And there was also things like the My Lai massacre that now we know about it. And I don't exactly remember the details about how it came out and everything, but there's this idea, and this is something that I grew up believing, that the um, American military and the people that join and the people that are part of it are good and noble people, and that the American military is a good and noble institution that is just trying to bring freedom and democracy. I grew up in a military family, and for the first, I would say, 15 years of my life, I was very much like that. That was what we were told always. And then you read about things like the My Lai massacre that the American government, the American army and military institution um, executed. And, you think of like mass rapes and murders. And something that I think about is I'm like, that is what we are told other militaries and other governments do. As a kid growing up in the Imperial Corps, we are told that everyone else is doing stuff like that, and we are the ones fighting against those people. You never really think about until you're faced with the reality that maybe we're the ones perpetrating that harm. Um, and a lot of Americans, I don't think, realize this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I do want to emphasize something in relation to Vietnam in a second, but you mentioned, just like a lot of atrocities that were committed by US soldiers in Vietnam. There was a story, I think it was about 10 plus years ago, that kind of circulated about a German soldier in Afghanistan, a part of the NATO mission there, who mutilated the corpse of an Afghan militant, and it was like very very reprehensible and very horrifying, and it obviously got the discussions that it needed to have. Like, it's absolutely, we should not be in Afghanistan in the first place, and there should not be any room for European, North American, or any of their soldiers of their vassal states to brutalize and mutilate and to senselessly murder civilians and different sorts of militants in a country halfway around the world. But you have to maybe consider, if that soldier in question was American, would it have received the same traffic? Would domestic sources in the United States have paid the appropriate attention to it? I think that so-called left-wing or liberal press in the United States is very cautious about appearing in any way critical of the U.S. military or of its conduct in other countries. And of course, that's what you also pointed out in relation to Vietnam. Um, but I think that if we circle back to Vietnam, and perhaps an inciting incident of the escalated U.S. presence in Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the U.S. claimed that the North Vietnamese fired upon American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. Why were they there in the first place? Why should we just accept that? But anyways, U.S. media at the time took that and they ran with it, that this was some kind of, infringement on American security. This showed the aggression of North Vietnam. Good luck finding it on a map, though, against big bad but innocent U.S. And I think that it's really reprehensible that we had U.S. media in this country, taking this story from the White House, from the State Department about this unproven assault on the U.S. Navy in another continent and characterizing it as an attack upon America itself and using that basically to justify and agitate that kind of military presence that we did see in Vietnam for about 15 years. So I think that is really a big function of the capitalist press, and that is the essence of manufacturing consent. It's trying to put a rubber stamp to get enough people, and that Lord knows there are enough Americans of like the middle classes in particular, who are kind of blindly patriotic, very thoroughly religious, not very politically active, who will take any infringement against the US's honor and run with it to excuse and to commit any kind of atrocity in any country around the world, and even, of course, as we know, in our own streets.
Absolutely. And something I think about in relation to the Vietnam War, but a little more contemporary, would be the Iraq War and the manufacturing consent around the fact that Saddam Hussein had apparently had weapons of mass destruction. We have known that this was never true. Saddam Hussein never had weapons of mass destruction. And there's evidence to prove as much. There were many different investigations done, and there was no conclusive evidence that found that he did. But still, um, especially post 9/11, Americans were out for blood. They wanted, they wanted an answer to the violence that happened on 9/11 and the thousands of lives that were lost. And so people were still willing to go along with the Iraq War, but we can also see there was even more political dissent around it. And there was, I think, one of the largest protests in American history in New York around not going into the Iraq War, and staying out of the Middle East and everything, because there was no evidence to prove that that Iraq had anything to do with 9/11, and they didn't. They had nothing to do with it. And uh, it's this idea that somehow we needed to just go and destroy another Muslim country, another country with majority Muslim people, black and brown people, more brown people specifically, to basically to get revenge about what happened. It was very much about revenge against anyone who the American government felt was necessary to carry out that revenge against. What would you say about that?
Well, yeah, like there's definitely a correlation with the Gulf of Tonkin incident to the fear mongering around some supposed arsenal of nuclear weapons that existed in Iraq, supposedly. And we know now in hindsight that it never did. But like if we were to, take into consideration the big mobilization of the peace movement in that time, or even many of the working class, which is, through its unions relatively inactive, but even around the Iraq War, mobilized around even the Democratic Party, which was so soft in its criticism of the Iraq War, only as a means to get the United States out of there. I think that the working class and the studentry and the vast majority, like not the vast majority, but definitely a majority of people in this country were either sure that the U.S. media and the U.S. government were lying about Iraq, or they knew that the whole truth was not being told. And this is not, necessarily the fault of working class people or the majority of people in this country at large, that more and more people did not become active against this really unjustifiable war. As we know, before 2024, George W. Bush was able to win the popular vote. as from the Republican Party, which is incredibly rare. And I think that that fear mongering about Saddam Hussein and Iraq was a pretty big factor in mobilizing enough of those middle class elements in rural America to, you know, give a rubber stamp to this unjustifiable conflict. But I want to highlight Phil Donahue of, I believe, MSNBC, who was fired for voicing some of these very logical criticisms about the veracity of Saddam Hussein's nuclear arsenal or any other kind of weapon of mass destruction in Iraq. And to really just consider that, if we had state media in this country, if the government directly administered media, as you can maybe contrast to compared to the DPRK, and an anchor who was critical of foreign policy or policy in general, who was unceremoniously and shamefully removed from their position, we would call it dictatorship. We would call it authoritarianism. But it is not dissimilar at all, I would argue, that one of the six major, or a branch of one of the six major media outlets in this country removes a solitary critic for voicing logical exposures and confusion and outrage about government policy and the policy of a government that represents those monopolies. It is not dissimilar at all. That is a dictatorship over information, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie trying to hold on to a monopoly on the truth. And Phil Donahue is just one example. We can point to Stephen Colbert. We can point to Jimmy Kimmel in opposition, perhaps, to these pundits, these hosts, whatever, as being too soft, as really not being that vocal as critics, getting to the heart of the issue. But if they are under attack and if their livelihoods and their platforms are being ripped away, then no one is safe to tell the real story about the Iraq wars and the Trump administrations and the Patriot Acts of this country. I use the plural there because, as you mentioned earlier with the Epstein case, we do not know the whole truth, and we will not know the whole truth until the proper resources and labor goes towards an independent media organization by, of, and for working and oppressed people.
Absolutely. I think of when we talk about like everything you just said, I love that because you're right. And it's I think that something that I think about when we are discussing manufacturing consent um, in this country and the inability of mainstream news media to have any dissenting voices against what the bourgeois class is currently doing against working class people. Something I think about is the Obama era and how after the 2008 market crash, there was a huge push for hope and change. That was his whole campaign slogan, was basically doing it differently and trying and going against the grain essentially and basically saying like we're going to change the way we're going to help working class Americans. And then when Obama got into office, what did he do? He bailed out the banks. There was no actual accountability for the people that caused the 2008 market crash, and we still haven't fully recovered from it because it was wholly and fully the responsibility, the blame lies squarely on the shoulders of the bourgeois class that knew this could happen and didn't care. They did not care that working people were being actively hurt in this situation because to them there was so much money to be made that it didn't really matter because even no matter if it was a Democrat or Republican in office, they were always going to bail out the banks. They were always going to side with the bourgeois class. And I think a lot of people became very turned off by the Democrats once Obama did that. because it was directly against the promises that he had made to the American people of how he was going to handle the situation. And it's similar with the Clintons. You know, we see the same kind of problems with the Clintons. We see the same problems with the Biden administration and everything. And it really speaks to this idea that it doesn't matter if there's as you said, the Democrats are just the conservative party of America, with a rainbow flag, cosplaying as people who actually who really they don't care about um, liberation or the rights of oppressed or working class people. They use it specifically as talking points. And then you have the Republican Reactionary Party, where on Fox News, an anchor straight up said, "I think we should euthanize homeless people." That he said that out in the open, and the only way that all he did as an apology was tweet. He said he tweeted about it. He was like, "I shouldn't have said that. That was really screwed up of me. Sorry." And then
Or we could highlight the same. I'm sorry to cut you off,
no,
but that
yeah,
but I don't want to forget this point. But there was yet another. I don't know if it was the same, because there's so many. There's just so many pundits out there for Fox News. But he said that he basically summarize the UN summit that's going on now as like a bullying of America and Israel. And he said that it should be bombed. And someone reminded him, you know, that's in New York, right? Oh, so maybe there, he said, maybe there'll be some collateral damage. He said maybe there'll be some fallout. So
what?
you have one of the, yeah, he said that the UN is bullying the US and
Insanity.
Israel, and that the UN offices or premises should be bombed in an American city. So,
In New York, no
it,
less.
right, already a city that has had its fair share of terroristic attacks. And, you know, if the U.S. government is the primary global exporter of terrorism, we can import it to itself. Why not? That's what Fox News loves. They hate trade so much that they're putting a tariff on America's terroristic acts. Imagine that.
Which
Um,
is
so,
hilarious if it wasn't so terrible.
right. No, yeah. I think what Fox News has going on for it, and I do want to go back to what you were saying in a second, is that Fox News is incredibly agitational, and there's a lot to agitate. People are frustrated. People are angry. They're tired of
They're
living
scared.
paycheck. Yes,
Yeah.
they're scared of living, of what's going to happen to them. Are they going to be able to send their kids to college? Are they going to afford next month's rent? Are they going to be able to go to the doctor and get the prescription they need for their a very serious illness, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what Fox News and like especially maybe conspiracy theorists also benefit from, is they play off of emotion and inject into this misinformation that not just neutralizes productive political activity, but it excuse me, but reinforces not just ignorance, but political activity that strengthens the status quo. The status quo of, oh, Joe Biden, he's practically a communist. We need to save America with Donald Trump, when Donald Trump only funds the military slightly more. Donald Trump only gives the billionaires in this country a slightly more loose tax cut. It's just marginalization for the benefit of the ruling class in this country, and it's sold to Americans as freedom, as liberating this country, as protecting this country. It's playing off of emotion to tighten the grip of the bourgeoisie over our lives, and to strengthen their state. But I think that's what we're seeing with this kind of fear mongering around the UN. America doesn't want to be held accountable. The American bourgeoisie want to retain their hegemonic position. They don't want anyone to get in their way. So if they can spread this idea that the UN is a gang of bullies against the United States and its good old pal Israel, then it not only manufactures consent, because I don't think people accept the Trump regime. They don't accept the Israeli Zionist colonial regime. It is inventing a reality that is entirely false. The
Mm-hmm.
U.S. is not a victim. Israel is not a victim. It is the criminal. They are the criminals who have perpetrate genocide, destabilize regions, and plunder whole continents for the benefit of their monopoly bourgeoisie. Um, but
Absolutely.
I'm sorry for cutting you off and
No,
going
no,
on a
no.
whole tangent there, but returning to what you were saying with the Fox News host that maybe it was the same person who uh called for the euthanization of homeless folks. Well, maybe carry that thought a little forward.
Well, I think that it speaks to this broader idea that Americans are looking for a solution, and then you see this extreme right-wing media that is basically condoning just like relentless violence as the answer to that. When we see, like, for example, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and I was very unsurprised to see that the kid that did this came from a very right-wing religious Mormon family in Utah, um, who may not have been right wing himself, but was inundated in that culture of guns and very like reactionary thoughts and points of view, in which whether he was of the left or not really doesn't matter, because I mean there is no evidence to prove that he was, but also it is overwhelmingly right wing adjacent people who carry out this violence against people, against others and marginalized communities. And Charlie Kirk was by no means a marginalized person, but the violence that was done to him is something that he actively supported. He was fine with it. He is quoted saying that there are going to be um, deaths from gun violence every year, but that is a apparently a prudent deal. That is a rational deal to him, until he's lost his life. And then I would want to know beyond the grave what Charlie Kirk's opinion now would be, now that he can't watch his children grow up. His wife is a widow. What I don't think that these people really realize that that violence can be turned against them. This Fox News host is very open about his support of just openly neo-Nazi fascist ideas of killing homeless people senselessly, which is, by the way, something the Nazis did do. There was a euthanasia program, which was just coordinated mass killing of quote unquote undesirables, which was disabled people, homeless people, anyone that they found to be undesirable to the Nazi Party. And I think it's really important to understand that this is a very scary path that we're going down. Allowing someone on mainstream news media to say that, and there are literally no repercussions, that is dangerous. That is even more dangerous, in my opinion, than the firing or the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel, which he's back now. But I think it's even more dangerous that a Fox News host is allowed to say that, and he's not taken off the air. Why isn't the FCC taking him off the air? Oh, right, because they're in the same pockets of the same people. One person who happens to own one of the biggest, I don't like, it's not a private equity firm. It's Blackstone? Larry Fink. Larry Fink. He is like the CEO of Blackstone or Black whatever. It's not Blackwater because that's a mercenary group. But they own significant portions of many of these mainstream news media outlets, which I don't think a lot of people really realize.
Yeah, I mean, we I kind of touched on it earlier that most of the major media companies in this country can be traced back to six titled owners. Um, and obviously there's so many different kinds of investors and producers and collaborators. There's syndication to local broadcast networks, but at the end of the day, and this is something, of course, that that the Reagan administration in the '80s paved the way for corporate consolidation of the media, and also for loosening the standards of sourcing and veracity in their journalism. And this is again all paving the way for tightening not just a monopoly over media companies, but attempting to usurp a monopoly on the truth itself. Um, and when we talk about bad actors within this very like this lake, this closed system of ownership over media, And the fact that there's so little accountability for them, but working class people in this country are losing their jobs for making jokes or for asking questions or for shaking off or reposting uh coverage or coverage of Charlie Kirk's death or criticism of him. And like that tells you everything you need to know. The fact that there are that same Fox News hosts, those same Fox News hosts that we talked about, who joke about classicide of homeless folks, who talk about bombing the UN in an American city. Maybe they're joking. Okay, great. But if a single mother who works at a McDonald's in Kentucky is fired for, commenting "Rip Bozo" on a Facebook post about Charlie Kirk, she can lose her job. That tells you everything you need to know about the class dynamics of this country. That all the accountability that exists in this country is for working class people, and that free speech is not free at all when it can be bought by six corporations and they face no accountability whatsoever. And in fact, they have a license to lie, but working class people and students can lose their educations, can lose their jobs, can be ostracized because they told the truth, because they made jokes, or because they shared posts of the same. And that is what we have to talk. That is, I think this is why I think the term inventing reality is more appropriate, because this is obviously not consent that is being manufactured. It is inventing a reality where there is no pretense of having freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of press. It is inventing a reality where we almost accept, and in fact, we do. There are those in the society that do consent to having no rights, to not being politically active, to not questioning the status quo. And that's unacceptable, and that is the slippery slope that we face when people like Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert, you can go back to the Phil Donahues of the Iraq War days, when they are silenced or muzzled or delayed in any fashion because they're just a little critical. They're critical in that good old liberal sense. It that is the first domino that falls before there is massive censorship, before there is perhaps state-owned media, and perhaps there are fines for dangerous speech. I'm not trying to get all 1984 here. Uh, I'm not Noam Chomsky, but bourgeois dictatorships that tear off the mask and they go full froth. This is what they do, and what we're seeing in this country, and I think what the state of the media exposes is this inclination of our bourgeoisie to throw away any excuse, any barrier to securing the class interests of the bourgeoisie in America.
Absolutely. I think that something that I think about that I think is more in our face around um, how states are willing to silence media, which is actively threatening their hold over um, the narrative of reality, is the journalists in Gaza. Over 200 journalists in Gaza have been murdered by the Israeli state. That's not to mention, of course, the thousands of men, women, and children, innocent people that have been murdered by Israel. But they have specifically targeted journalists who are living in Gaza, who have been reporting on the atrocities that are happening, who are being murdered by the state for those reasons, because that they are showing images that are coming out of 10-year-olds who have their guts hanging out of their bellies because they've been blown up. Who Children who have bullets in their heads because they've been sniped by Israeli soldiers who are acting like, I didn't know. How didn't you know? There is footage, there is proof that you targeted a child who was just going to get food. Like there is so much overwhelmingly there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to prove that the Israeli state has been actively targeting journalists who are reporting on the atrocities that they are carrying out, because they know it's wrong. If they weren't doing it, that would be interesting. But it's the fact that they are, and they know deep down that what they are doing is reprehensible, to say the least. And if the images are allowed to get out, then that means that they have, in some ways, lost the war of inventing reality, as you said, because the reality is on our phone screens. While CNN and MSNBC have no problem lying to our faces about what's happening, Al Jazeera doesn't. Al Jazeera and all of the journalists in Gaza have been showing us the realities of what Palestinian people are going through, and regular people, the Deborahs and the Barbaras of the American suburbs, are seeing these images and they're realizing, oh, my tax dollars are funding this. Oh dear, I didn't like people are starting to realize, and I think that that really started to happen around a year and a half into the war, or not the war, the genocide, when the grip that Israel had over manufacturing consent has started to slip because of this. Because how can you continue to justify this? Especially when they went after Iran and they bombed Iran. There is no such thing as a preemptive strike. That's just a strike. You're just bombing someone.
Hmm.
Like that. The idea that a preemptive strike is somehow a legitimate. It's mind-boggling, honestly.
Right, and but that is the language that is going to be used from corporate media sources, in the Western world, because if things were to escalate between Israel and Iran, then Iran needs to be portrayed as the aggressor, and it's bigger than just, you know, standing by our great ally in Western Asia of Israel. It's this idea of laying the conditions for manufacturing consent for a war with Iran. The Deborahs and the Barbaras of this country, as you called them, are going to be a lot more accepting of U.S. intervention against Iran if they've been conditioned to view Iran as this Israel hating, bloodthirsty, theocratic, women hating state in Western Asia that hates America, wants to nuke America, wants to destroy our ally, and commit a second Holocaust in the 21st century. And this is the real danger of bourgeois press. And this is the a great importance of independent press. Now, obviously, there's so many things to be critical with about Iran, and that we recognize that Iran, more than just being theocratic, is itself a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, tied to this kind of camp with Russia and China. But that doesn't mean that the US should just go in there and destroy them. That doesn't mean that for China. It doesn't mean that for the DPRK. And it doesn't mean that for Venezuela or Syria or Russia or anyone else that opposes American interests and the interests of its imperialist class. Um, but all the same, we should develop that same resistance to this imposed conditioning. We should begin to promote our solidarity with Iranian people in the same way as we are doing that with Palestinian people, in the same way as bourgeois press is perfectly capable of doing with Ukrainian people. That's not problematic
Period.
at all. Other white victims of imperialism, a victim of a U.S. rival, we can tell their stories. But the people who tell the stories of brown Palestinian children who are the same victims of America's ally and America itself, they are silenced. Those journalists are killed. And people who post about it or are active about it in the streets, they lose their jobs because of it. Um, I think that fundamentally, at the end of the day, uh, corporate media and capitalist press overall is only the voice of class dictatorship in this country that exposes for once and for all, as you said earlier, that there is no real democracy in this country.
Yeah, I think and it's very important to understand that this manufacturing consent is not just around what we are doing abroad, but it is also happening. It's happening around what the American government and institutions are doing here at home. We can see the killing of black and brown people by the police, for example. When a white cop murders a black man or a black woman, or just a black person in general, they are put on paid leave. Um, and that the perception around what the crime that this person carried out is very much, well, they were just trying to protect themselves. They didn't know. It's not a big deal because, well, what if this person had a gun? What if this person was a dangerous gang member? And Americans eat that shit up. Like white Americans, especially in the burbs and all of that, love to eat it up around this idea that there's these dangerous black people who are trying to take over your suburb or whatever, or your very white neighborhood, and they're in gangs. And like, this is legitimately the narrative that has been spun for decades around um black and brown neighborhoods and black and brown people. I do want to highlight, missing and murdered indigenous women, for example. When a
Right.
when a white woman and when a white woman is has a violence done against her, or is goes missing, or something goes wrong, immediately all of the press and the cops and every institution is on it trying to get justice or find this woman. But when it happens to a black or a brown woman or an indigenous woman, all of a sudden there is no discussion around, where did she go or what happened to her.
Can I
Oftentimes,
raise a
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I want to raise a point to that because I also think it's not just the very terrible reality of for instance, indigenous women who are murdered or go missing. But it's also the very struggle to bring investigation or truth about these circumstances to life that are co-opted by facets or actors of bourgeois press and bourgeois culture. For instance, I believe it was the Biden administration who signed some gesture into like recognizing the violence against indigenous women and explore, promising to open cold cases or to explore the missing person cases around indigenous women in very rural areas around indigenous what are they, reservations in states
Yeah,
like Wyoming.
yeah, they're called
Uh,
reservations.
right. And uh, it was a white filmmaker for the movie Wind River who patted himself on the back for that. And his own indigenous castmates, tore him to shreds for that because it flew over all of the hard work and organizing of indigenous people themselves to demand action from the federal government on missing persons and murdered women among the indigenous community for decades. And that is the thing about bourgeois press, that even if they talk about change, even if they address things that need to change, they will never accredit the independent action of working and oppressed people, but they will be quick to pat themselves on the back and to lift up the voices of local politicians or of filmmakers or whatever the case may be. And that's very much by design. They do not want working and oppressed people to be inspired to go out into the streets and go out to their workplaces, into their universities and make real change. They want to make you think that it's only possible through elections, only possible through a film, a film or a TV show, or wearing dashiki, politicians wearing dashikis and bowing their heads. That's how they think change is. They want us to think change is accomplished. That's because they want nothing to change. Um, but I'm sorry again for cutting you off.
No,
I
you're
just like that.
good.
That just yeah. I just wanted to not miss that because
It's important.
it's more. Yeah, yeah. Because there's you and I, we're active, and we have been engaged for a while, and sometimes you think that nothing is being accomplished and that things are only continuously getting worse, but we have to resist that. We have to, because it's been what we've told
Hmm.
always, that going to the streets or boycotts don't work, striking and unionizing, it doesn't work, protesting doesn't work. You are physically making it more expensive for the bourgeoisie to accomplish what they're doing. You are pulling troops and guns and resources away from their harassment of people of color and from homeless people and from other marginalized communities in this country, and you are inspiring others to do the same. And I
Absolutely.
think and you're not going to hear that from CNN or Fox News that that is the real cost of civil disobedience and of popular mobilization. But the fact is, it's going to have to cost them a lot more, and we're going to have to be a lot more mobilized if we're going to change anything fundamentally. And that's not going to happen if we allow ourselves to be duped, distracted, divided, comforted, or demoralized by capitalist press. And that's a huge function of it.
Absolutely. I think that something very recent that I think about when I think about the conversation around missing and murdered Indigenous women, Black and Brown women that are victimized, something that I think about is the current case that I really hope will get more attention is the case around Celeste Rivas Hernandez, who went missing last year and was found dead and dismembered in a famous singer's car in LA. And I think it's really important to talk about this case and the swirl of internet stuff that's been going on around it, because this young girl who was 14 when she died and turned 15 the day before, or she would have turned 15 the day before her body was found, was a child who is in a very clearly, allegedly, I have to say allegedly, but she was very clearly allegedly in a relationship with an adult man. There was evidence of this, and it's just not being talked about. It's just not being talked about at all unless you're on Reddit and you're looking at people digging up old text messages and information that is very clearly out there. It's not hard to find if you just do some digging and you realize how desensitized we are to Black and brown women being, or young girls being victimized by rich and powerful people. Now, the person, David, who she was allegedly in a relationship with, now he wasn't some super, super rich person, but there is evidence to prove that he was paying people off to stay quiet about their relationship in her, the people that knew. And I think it's adding to this broader discussion around um, how we talk about Black and brown girls who are victimized by people like this. She was
Mhm.
11 when they met, and he
Right.
was 17. Like, why there wasn't more? She was clearly in his Discord. The people around him knew. There's no way they couldn't have known. She was living with him for a year and a half before she died. Um,
Hmm.
there were posters up around her about her. The family had clearly gone to the police and turned in a missing persons case, and the police didn't do anything about it. And then this girl turns up dead and dismembered in this person's car, and now it's a case. Now it's a case. People knew she was with him. And I've
Right.
been fixated on this case because it makes me so incredibly angry that this
Hmm.
girl, she's Mexican, who came from a poor family. This kind of talks, I guess, harkens a little bit back to the Epstein case and the fact that poor um, girls from poor families who don't have the means to be able to protect them from situations like this are often also not given the justice that they deserve by corporate media around powerful men who do terrible shit to them.
Can I address something to that?
Yeah.
I was watching this movie Spotlight, and there's a lot that I have to say on the case of Celeste and the singer. But I was watching this movie Spotlight that explored the very like the epidemic of sex abuse cases committed by Catholic priests in Boston parishes. And it goes into all the pressures and all the resistance and all of the roadblocks that the investigative team on this the Boston Herald, I believe, faced when going about this case. And you know, the character of Mark Ruffalo, and Mark Ruffalo is very interesting. Is a somewhat of a more left-wing social democratic actor, and you don't really see a lot of platforming of him, partially because of his political views. But uh, he, when someone asks his character, why didn't anyone speak up about this sooner? And he says, "Good Germans." Obviously referring to this idea that people in Nazi Germany were being good Germans by not speaking out about the crimes of Hitler and his regime. And he says, I don't know if that's a comparison you want to make, but I think that it is. I think in America, obviously, we're not talking about, the Holocaust and Hitler in our country, but we are talking about this social conditioning more broadly through our culture and through our media that rich and powerful people have to be good people. They donate millions of dollars to charity. They employ thousands of people. They renovate communities. They change the world. They are the most successful among us. They have to be doing something good. They have to be good people. But that is, of course, not true. And I think that we see this thread in the Epstein cases and with Celeste is the consequences of the social conditioning where people are defending David and they say, oh, um, his name is just on the rental for the car. Friends could have used it. Or, oh, the police are still investigating. He hasn't been charged. And I think that that is a conditioning, a result of conditioning about the inherent goodness of successful, quote unquote, people who work so hard, quote unquote, to become so rich and powerful. And as you said, David is not exactly, he's not,
He's no Epstein,
uh,
but he
right,
has money.
exactly. Exactly.
And
He
oh, sorry.
no no. I was just like one final thing is this. Is that I think part of that is people kind of resisting jumping to conclusions and wanting to make sure that the truth is told, and I think that's admirable. But I think that we need to be vigilant. We need to start being more analytical. We need to start having more discussions. And I think that we need to really start disabusing ourselves of this notion that because someone is a celebrity, that they are a good person, or that if a celebrity is a bad person, they have to be a sex offender or a human trafficker. There's layers to it.
Yeah,
It's a fine line to walk, and having money does not mean you're a good person, and being poor does not mean you should be a defender of wealth, because wealth is being stolen from you. And I think that that is a fundamental truth that should become as gospel to working class people. Otherwise, we're going to be caught in an endless cycle of he said, she said, or I'm going to defend David, or I want to know more on behalf of Celeste and other victims, or any other atrocity in our daily lives that occurs, and other stories that we don't know about. How many Celestes are there in this country who are still missing? You know?
exactly. That's really what I want to like. That's everything you just said is, very much in line with what I'm talking about here, which it's this idea that Celeste, I'm Puerto Rican. I'm half Puerto Rican, but I'm very white passing. I'm a very white passing person, and so I don't have to deal with the same problems as other women who are openly Hispanic and cannot hide their skin color or hide their heritage. But Celeste was not white passing. Celeste was an openly brown girl. She was a child. But I think that there is this conditioning in media to kind of see um, black and brown men as thugs and black and brown women as whores. And I don't mean to use such terrible language to disparage these groups, but more to give understanding to how people are seen in the media. Something that I think is very pertinent to this conversation as well is how black and brown people were portrayed during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and this idea that white people who were going to you know stores and everything and taking stuff to survive were seen as survivors, people who were surviving a terrible natural disaster. But black people and brown people who were seen, their pictures were being taken doing the same thing, were seen as criminals. Even in articles that were written about what was going on, they were literally being written as, a criminal was seen taking shoes from a store or something. And it's like, maybe it's just a person trying to survive, you know?
Right.
And when I think of Celeste and what happened to her, she was so young. She didn't even see high school. She
Right.
she she was an eighth grader when she went missing. And there's this idea, this underlying notion about Black and brown women that we are somehow more promiscuous inherently. And I think that kind of goes into why her case was not explored as much as it should have been when she went missing to begin with.
Hmm.
This was a young girl who was dating a grown man, allegedly. But there is a lot of evidence coming out online of people just doing basic internet searches and looking around at the fact that they were definitely dating. And
Right.
why weren't people talking about that?
And
Why?
I think,
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
well, what I wanted to basically is circle back to what I was talking about conditioning earlier, and it's bigger than just people reacting to it now, but I think it also speaks to this idea of if there is any level of defense, any level of kind of dismissiveness of, I ran across someone who said that people want it to be Celeste, that they want this missing case persons to be solved. We are normalizing and desensitizing ourselves to a reality where there is incredible victimization and marginalization of women of minority groups, and that those are women of color, those are trans women, those are migrant women.
Mm-hmm.
The list goes on and on. And at the end of the day, I'm not saying that we should hurry David to the guillotine, but what I am saying is that we can't stand up for a stranger we don't know because, oh, he's a young man, he's an up and coming artist, they don't know it's Celeste. We have to leave a space open for the truth to be told. We have to stop giving in to partisan struggles. For instance, like the whole thing with Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, to take a comparison, is that it's not just Donald Trump who is endangering free speech in this country. And believe it or not, it's not just Putin who assassinates journalists, supposedly, or I should say allegedly, in Russia, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is censoring, or sorry, correcting leftist bias in press in Hungary. It is fundamentally a condition, a symptom that will emanate from capitalism and its desire to keep us desensitized, to keep us distracted and divided, and to tell us that there is no hope, that we have to trust in the system and to not do anything, and that we have to accept that some people are going to go missing. We have to accept that some genocides are going to happen. We have to accept that some wars are inevitable, and that is absolutely not true. Capitalism needs it to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the reason I even brought up the Celeste case is to kind of bring it back to this idea of how media reports on situations like this because it is preventable. And one of the first ways that it is preventable is by holding rich people accountable. Working class people, we need to be holding the rich accountable for what they are doing. The media, like corporate media, does not want that to happen because these are the same people who are funding them. Now, David is not necessarily funding corporate media, but he is manufacturing an image around himself as someone who wouldn't do something like that when it was very obvious that he was, and people that are currently still trying to support him through something that he very obviously was involved in, even if he wasn't involved in her murder, which I find to be very hard to believe. Even if he wasn't involved in her murder, he was involved with this young teenage girl who was a
And look at
child.
how profitable it is to cover the
Yes,
story that's broken out. That's the
after
thing.
she's dead, after she's
Yeah,
already dead
exactly.
and dismembered in his car. That's the problem. Who?
Or you'll see posts. I remember there was a test for a new Amber Alert that came out over the course of the Biden administration, and you would see bloggers, you would see podcasters, you would see some local local broadcasters joking about it, complaining about it, when it should be celebrated that something is going on that's going to make it a little more easy to find a missing child if they are abducted or if they just disappear, like if they wandered off or went missing or whatever. That is something that should be celebrated, that infrastructure is being improved to ensure that missing youths are returned to their homes safe and sound. And it's mocked and derided and picked at as some kind of annoyance imposed upon us by the socialist administration of Joe Biden, which is just
Far from it.
absolutely ridiculous.
I know.
Exactly.
And it's this larger conversation around also how we view Black and brown people, how we view oppressed minorities and the working class, as somehow it is our fault that these things happen to us, not the fault of rich and powerful people who are actively exploiting Black and brown oppressed minorities and the working class in general, as a means to their own gain and their own ends. And I think that when I talk about the Celeste case, as you said, there are so many Celestes out there who are not getting the coverage that they deserve. Whether they are only missing or are dead as well, these Black and brown women are not being given the the voice and the opportunity to be heard as victims of violence from rich and powerful people. You know, Celeste is one of many, and it shouldn't be this way. It makes me so incredibly angry because I have a little sister who's only 10 years old. She's a year younger than Celeste was when she met David online. And there is no conversation happening right now around how young girls and young people in general are being taken advantage of by folks like David, who see them as easy targets. Once again, with the Epstein situation, he just happens to be a much higher profile higher profile person than David, who was doing the same shit. He was going after young working class girls who came from broken homes or came from poor homes, who were, looking for extra money or looking for extra, whatever it is. And that's how they got introduced to him. And that's why they continued to go back to his home, even when they knew this is wrong, but they didn't have any other choice because for a lot of them, this was their option in getting money and getting whatever it is that they needed. And Epstein openly exploited that, and that is not talked about enough. That is how he was able to exploit so many young girls, is because he specifically went after them in poor working class communities. And it is the same principle with, sorry, my cat. It's the same principle with Celeste, and she deserves that justice of, whether it was David that murdered her or not, we don't know. But whether we want to admit it or not, he had a relationship with a child, and no one did anything
Right.
about it.
Well, that's the thing. That I mean, you
Allegedly.
and I. Oh yeah. I mean, come on.
Sorry,
Uh,
allegedly.
you and I are Marxist-Leninists. We know that, there is exploitation. What is exploitation? Exploitation is you could sell at your job $300 worth of products and you still only got paid $17 for that. And maybe you have a union. Maybe you can get more regular wages so that only a small fraction of an increase goes up so that you aren't so much isn't being stolen from the fruit of your labor, but you accept it, especially if you don't have a union and there aren't a whole lot of good jobs available near you, because we need money to live. We need wages and jobs to live. Capitalism is that we work to live and we don't live to work. uh, we are basically a capitalism is a system of a giant hostage situation. We are
Mm,
basically paying our own ransoms in order to survive one more day. Um, and this is the root of exploitation. So if you talk about young girls like Celeste, who, if she joined the server and she started talking to David, it doesn't care. If there were girls who went to parties where Epstein was and approached him or introduced themselves to him, it wouldn't have mattered. And we know that's not the case, but it wouldn't have mattered anyways, because People are so alienated from themselves and their own safety and their own sense of identity because we need to survive. We need
Hmm.
to escape these conditions of exhaustion and stress and instability that we live through day in and day out at this grueling pace. And that is exploitation in itself. In the sense that we risk our lives, we risk our safety, we risk our happiness in order to survive one more day or to escape the mental strain of surviving in this capitalist state that we do. Um, and fundamentally, it is necessary to put the blame on loud women of color or promiscuous women of color or hypocritical, um, college students who are socialists but have an iPhone. It is basically victim blaming,
Socialism
and
is when
I
no
think
iPhone.
exactly. Uh, a big thing with capitalist press is victim blaming. Oh, the Black Lives Matter movement, they're burning down their own neighborhoods. I was actually kicked out of my home in the middle of a pandemic, by the way, by my very Republican father because he supported the murder of George Floyd, and I was a supporter of the movement again, like demanding justice against the
Mm.
murder of unarmed people of color. But he said they're burning down their own communities. And I said, Target and Starbucks are not the community of any working person, black, brown,
Period.
whatever. If you're not missing anything. You're acting as if the Louvre was burned down. It is a Target. There are
Yeah.
thousands of them, okay? And if one is looted, it doesn't hurt Target's profits in the least. But there will never be a new George Floyd. You cannot replace Breonna Taylor. Che Guevara said, and I think this is very true, the life of one person is worth more than the value of all private property on earth. And I think that it is nothing more than Stockholm syndrome, that there are working class people like my very own father who think that the victim is responsible for his own death. And I am so grateful to be a Marxist-Leninist. And
Mm. Same.
well, actually not, because it's, ignorance is bliss, actually,
Period.
we have to admit. But I am very grateful for the education that I've received from others, and I've really kind of ingrained into myself because I will never accept. And I think that that is the liberation that has to occur first, is the liberation of our mentality and our consciousness and our world outlook, our analytical eye towards the world. That is what saves us from demoralization, from hopelessness, from being angry and bitter towards the wrong people, towards self-destructive activities. And that is the moment when movements start to build. That is the moment when decrees start to formalize. That is the moment when we start to seize back the power that belongs to working people who are the foundation of society, not of the bloodsuckers who exploit us, who stand on our backs, and they spit on us when we speak out against it. So that
Yeah.
is like that's the thing. That is capitalist press. They are the mouth that spits onto the workers' back because we shake, because we raise our heads, because we raise our voices. That is what their function needs to be, is to silence us, to shame us, and to divide us.
Yes, absolutely. And as we get to the end of time here, I think that was a perfect way to end this segment because I mean you did fantastic. I mean this was such a fruitful conversation around manufacturing consent and how we view problems and issues happening around the world through this lens of both liberal news media and conservative alike versus independent media and how things are portrayed. And, an ending note that I want to say around the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, do not stop talking about her. Do not stop talking about her and the hundreds of other Black and Brown women that are victimized by rich and powerful people who use their bodies and their their youth as a means to exploit them. Celeste is one of many, but she was a person. She was a young girl, and I just want people to understand how this was never her fault. And there is, as Red talked about, a lot of victim blaming that happens in press and media around, well, why didn't her family stop her? Why didn't this? Why didn't that? This was a young girl who came from a very poor family, from what we can understand. And we we need to under we I need people to get loud about this situation, because there will be no justice unless we force it. um, David is a very rich person. He has a lot of money and he has a lot of backing. We need to hold him and every other bourgeois capitalist oppressor accountable for the ways in which they treat working people, and people from working class families who do not have the means to be able to alone advocate for themselves. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. And as we wind down, thank you for holding the show. I think that it's a fantastic outlook. Like this space and the work that you do is the development of a voice that needs to exist for working and oppressed people, not just in our country, not just in your locality, but around the world. And it's so important that we talked about Iraq, that we talked about Palestine, that we talked about Vietnam, and we talked about Celeste Rivas, and we talked about the nameless in like innumerable victims of capitalism, because it reminds me of that saying, no justice, no peace. And it sounds like a threat, but it's a reminder that until there is justice for the real criminals, for the real oppressors, for the real exploiters, there will never be peace for working and oppressed people. And the first weapon that must be used aren't random bullets, aren't lighting trash cans on fire or smashing windows at a protest. The first weapon that working and oppressed people must use is seizing back the truth from the blood-sucking mongrels in tuxedos that slap all manner of slanders and libels and shaming to segments, to podcasts, to articles, shaming us for speaking
Hmm.
out. So, in that vein, developing this space and platforming other working people, people that are, of course, outside of our party, people that we work with, allies of other organizations, is absolutely essential, because no movement will be developed that can fundamentally change the dynamic of the world that we live in, to offer radical solutions to radical problems.
Absolutely.
And you're getting to the root of it. You're being radical, and that is fantastic work. Like this is what the journalism that must exist if people are going to get excited, be inspired to learn, and to not lose hope for a better world.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Oh my gosh, thank you. Well, I thank you so much for coming on, and I'm super excited to air this episode. Yeah, everyone, Red.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Felicity.
Of course.